Chapter 7 Battle Tactics. After several years in Saskatoon, my family moved into a new neighborhood. River Road was on the banks of the Saskatchewan River, but on the lower and more plebeian side. The community on River Road was considerably relaxed in character, and there was a good deal of tolerance for individual idiosyncrasies. Only 3 doors down from the street from us lived a retired school teacher who had spent years in Alaska, who had brought with him into retirement a team of Alaskan Huskies. These were magnificent dogs that commanded respect not only from the local canine population, but from the human one as well. 3 of them once caught a burglar on their master's premises, and they reduced him to butcher's meat with a dispatch that we youngsters much admired. Across the alley from us lived a barber who maintained a sort of transient's rest for stray mongrels. There was an unkind rumor to the effect that he encouraged these strays only in order to practice his trade upon them. The rumor gained stature from the indisputable fact that some of the oddly assorted collection of dogs sported unusual haircuts. I came to know the barber intimately during the years that followed, and he confided his secret to me. Once, many years earlier, he had seen a French poodle shaven and shorn, and he'd been convinced that he could devise even more spectacular hairstyles for dogs, and perhaps make a fortune and a reputation for himself. His experiments were not without artistic merit, even though some of them resulted in visits from the Humane Society inspectors. I had no trouble fitting myself into this new community, but the adjustment was not so simple for Mutt. The canine population of River Road was enormous. Mutt had to come to terms with these dogs, and he found the going hard. His long, silken hair and his fine feathers tended to give him a soft and sentimental look that was misleading and seemed to goad the roughneck local dogs into active hostility. They usually went about in packs, and the largest pack was led by a well-built bull terrier who lived next door to us. Mutt, who was never a joiner, preferred to go his way alone, and this made him particularly suspect by the other dogs. They began to lay for him. He was not by nature the fighting kind. In all his life I'd never known him to engage in battle unless there was no alternative. His was an eminently civilized attitude, but one that other dogs could seldom understand. They taunted him because of it. His pacific attitude used to embarrass my mother when the two of them happened to encounter a belligerent strange dog while they were out walking. Mutt would waste no time in idle braggadocio. At first glimpse of the stranger, he would insinuate himself under mother's skirt, and no amount of physical force nor scathing comment could budge him from the sanctuary. Often the strange dog would not realize that it was a sanctuary, and this was sometimes rather hard on mother. Despite his repugnance towards fighting, Mutt was no coward, nor was he unable to defend himself. He had his own ideas on how to fight, ideas which were unique but formidable. Just how efficacious they actually were was demonstrated to us all within a week of our arrival at our new address. Knowing nothing of the neighborhood, Mutt dared to go where even bulldogs feared to tread, and one morning he foolishly pursued a cat into the ex-schoolteacher's yard. He was immediately surrounded by 4 ravening huskies. They were a merciless lot, and they closed in for the kill. Mutt saw at once that this time he would have to fight. With one quick motion, he flung himself over on his back and began to pedal furiously with all 4 feet. It looked rather as if he were riding a bicycle built for 2, but upside down. He also began to sound his siren. This was a noise he made, just how I do not know, deep in the back of his throat. It was a kind of frenzied wail. The siren rose in pitch and volume as his legs increased their RPMs till he began to sound like a gas turbine at full throttle. The effects of this unorthodox behavior on the 4 huskies was to bring them to an abrupt halt. Their ears went forward and their tails uncurled as a look of pained bewilderment wrinkled their brows. And then slowly, and one by one, they began to back away, their eyes uneasily averted from this distressing spectacle before them. When they were 10 feet from Mutt, they turned as one dog and fled without dignity for their own backyard. The mere sight of Mutt's bicycle tactics, as we refer to them, was usually sufficient to avoid bloodshed, but on occasion a foolhardy dog would refuse to be intimidated. The results in those cases could be rather frightful, for Mutt's strange posture of defense was not altogether empty bombast. Once when we were out hunting gophers, Mutt was attacked by a farm collie who, I think, was slightly mad. He looked mad, for he had one white eye and one blue eye, and the combination gave him a maniac expression. And he acted mad, for he flung himself onto the inverted Mutt without the slightest hesitation. Mutt grunted when the collie came down on top of him, and for an instant the tempo of his legs was slowed. Then he exerted himself and, as if it were, put on a sprint. The collie became airborne, bouncing up and down as a rubber ball bounces on the end of a water jet. Each time he came down, he was raked fore and aft by 4 sets of rapidly moving claws, and when he finally fell clear, he was bleeding from a dozen ugly scratches, and he had a bellyful. He fled. Mutt did not pursue him. He was always magnanimous in victory. Had he been willing to engage deliberately in a few such duels with the neighborhood dogs, Mutt would have undoubtedly won their quick acceptance. But such was his belief in the principles of nonviolence, as these applied to other dogs at least, that he continued to avoid combat. The local packs, and particularly the one led by the bull terrier next door, spared no pains to bring him to battle, and for some time he was forced to stay very close to home, unless he was accompanied by mother or by myself. It was nearly a month before he found a solution to this problem. The solution he eventually adopted was typical of him. Almost all the backyards in Saskatoon were fenced with vertical planking nailed to horizontal 2x4s. The upper 2x4s in each case was usually 5 or 6 feet above the ground and about 5 inches below the projecting tops of the upright planks. For generations, these elevated gangways have provided a safe thoroughfare for cats. One fine day, Mutt decided they would serve him too. I was brushing my teeth after breakfast when I heard Mutt give a yelp of pain, and I went at once to the window and looked out. I was in time to see him laboriously climb up on our back fence from a garbage pail that stood by the yard gate. As I watched, he wobbled a few steps along the upper 2x4, lost his balance, and fell off. Undaunted, he returned to the garbage pail and tried again. I went outside and tried to reason with him, but he ignored me. When I left, he was still at it, climbing up, staggering along for a few feet, then falling off again. I mentioned this new interest of his during dinner that night, but none of us gave it much thought. We were all used to Mutt's peculiarities, and we had no suspicion that there was method behind this apparent foolishness. Yet method there was, as I discovered a few evenings later. A squad of Bengal lancers, consisting of 2 of my friends and myself, armed with spears made from bamboo fishing rods, had spent the afternoon riding up and down the back alleys on our bicycles, hunting tigers, alley cats. As supper time approached, we were slowly pedaling our way homeward along the alley behind River Road when one of my chums, who was little in the lead, gave a startled yelp and swerved his bike, so I crashed into him and we fell together on the sun-baked dirt. I picked myself up and saw my friend pointing at the fence ahead of us. His eyes were big with disbelief. The cause of the accident, and of my chum's incredulity, was nonchalantly picking his way along the top of the fence not 50 yards away. Behind that fence lay the home of the Huskies, and although we could not see them, we, and most of Saskatoon, could hear them. Their frenzied howls were punctuated by dull thudding sounds as they leaped at the tormentor and fell back hopelessly to earth again. Mutt never hesitated. He ambled along his aerial route with the leisurely insouciance of an old gentleman out for an evening stroll. The Huskies must have been wild with frustration. I was grateful that the fence lay between them and us. We 3 boys had not recovered from our initial surprise when a new canine contingent arrived upon the scene. It included 6 or 7 of the local dogs, headed by the bull terrier, attracted to the scene by the yammering of the Huskies. They spotted Mutt, and the terrier immediately led a mass assault. He launched himself against the fence with such foolhardy violence that only a bull terrier could have survived the impact. We were somewhat intimidated by the frenzy of all these dogs, and we lowered our spears to the ready position, undecided whether to attempt Mutt's rescue or not. In the event, we were not needed. Mutt remained unperturbed, although this may have only been an illusion, resulting from the fact that he was concentrating so hard on his balancing act that he could spare no attention for his assailants. He moved along at a slow but steady pace, and having safely navigated the Huskies' fence, he jumped to the slightly higher fence next door, and stepped along until he came to a garage. With a graceful leap, he gained the garage roof, where he lay down for a few minutes, ostensibly to rest, but actually, I am certain, to enjoy his triumph. Below him there was pandemonium. I have never seen a dog so angry as that bull terrier was. Although the garage wall facing the alley was a good 8 feet high, the terrier kept hurling himself impotently against it until he must have been one large quivering bruise. Mutt watched the performance for 2 or 3 minutes, then he stood up, and with one insolent backwards glance jumped down to the dividing fence between 2 houses and ambled along it to the street front beyond. The tumult in the alley subsided, and the pack dogs began to disperse. Most of the dogs must have realized that they would have to run halfway round the block to regain Mutt's trail, and by then he might be far away. Dispiritedly, they began to drift off until finally only the bull terrier remained. He was still hurling himself at the garage wall in a paroxysm of fury when I took it myself home to tell the wonders I had seen. From that day forth, the dogs of the neighborhood gave up on their attempts against Mutt and came to a tacit acceptance of him, all that is, except the bull terrier. Perhaps his handball game against the fence had addled his brain, or maybe it was he was just too stubborn to give up. At any rate, he continued to lurk in ambush for Mutt, and Mutt continued to avoid him easily enough until the early winter, when the terrier, now completely unbalanced, one day attempted to cross the street in pursuit of his enemy, and without bothering to look for traffic, he was run over by an old Model T. Mutt's remarkable skill as a fence walker could have led to leadership of the neighborhood dogs, had that been what was desired, for his unique talent gave him a considerable edge in the popular game of catch-cat. But Mutt remained a lone walker, content to be left to his own devices. He did not give up fence walking, even when the original need had passed. He took a deep pride in his accomplishment, and he kept in practice. I used to show him off to my friends, and was not above making small bets with strange boys about the abilities of my acrobatic dog. When I won, as I always did, I would reward Mutt with candy-coated gum. This was one of his favorite confections, and he would chew away at a wad of it until the last vestige of mint flavor had vanished, whereupon he would swallow the tasteless remnant. Mother thought that this was bad for him, but as far as I know, it never had any adverse effect upon his digestive system, which could absorb most things with impunity.